Welcome back, night owls. Tonight we're setting aside the pharaohs and golden tombs to look at something far more mysterious and often overlooked. The queens. Not the symbols or sidekicks, not the silent figures beside the throne. We're talking about the real women behind Egypt's most powerful men. Women who weren't just present, but pivotal. Queens who made diplomatic moves behind closed doors, who managed temples, controlled royal succession, and, when needed, took the throne themselves. From Tiye's quiet diplomacy to Hatshepsut's outright rule, these were women who reshaped dynasties while the world watched the crowns. So if you've ever thought ancient queens were just decorative, think again. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back to a time where power didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it whispered behind one. This is History for Sleep, the secret lives of ancient Egyptian queens. Chapter 1. Beneath the Golden Glory. When most people picture queens of ancient Egypt, they imagine women wrapped in fine linen, skin painted with gold dust, standing quietly beside pharaohs in statues and tombs, always poised, always graceful, always still. But stillness is not silence. And behind the glittering walls of temples and palaces, these women were anything but passive. Queens in ancient Egypt held titles that carried real power. They were not simply wives. They were the great royal wife, the God's wife of Amun, the mistress of the two lands. These were not empty titles. They implied duty, spiritual significance, and, sometimes, direct political authority. To be a queen was to carry an identity both sacred and strategic. She was a mother to the heir, a priestess to the gods, and often the closest advisor to the king. Most queens lived in the shadows of history, overshadowed by their husbands or erased by later dynasties. But their fingerprints are still there, pressed quietly into every stone wall, every royal decree, every shifting alliance. Queens were not chosen for love. They were born into dynasties or selected for bloodline, lineage, and the sacred balance of divine kingship. A royal wife might be a half-sister, a cousin, or a foreign princess sent to cement a political treaty. Marriage wasn't personal, it was national. And once inside the palace, life changed forever. The queen lived in the harem palace, a compound separate from the pharaoh, yet tightly controlled by palace officials, guards and scribes. But this wasn't the passive, luxurious prison you might imagine. It was a center of female power, filled with elite women, political mothers, priestesses, musicians and bureaucrats, a training ground, a refuge, and sometimes a battlefield. There were rivalries, there were hierarchies. The title of Great Royal Wife was the top of the ladder, but many women fought quietly beneath her for influence, attention, and eventual succession for their sons. And when the pharaoh died, everything changed again. The queen's fate then depended on what kind of legacy her husband left behind, and whether her son had the strength or backing to take the throne. If he didn't, she might become regent, ruling in his name until he came of age. Or she might be quietly removed, or worse, forgotten entirely. But even in death, queens didn't disappear. They were buried with ceremony, surrounded by symbols of rebirth, nourishment, and divine transformation. Their tombs told stories with paint, stone, and spells, prayers not just for eternal life, but for eternal memory. Yet many queens were forgotten, erased by time, by jealous successors, or by the simple fact that men wrote most of the history. When we speak of queens in ancient Egypt, it's easy to let the image fade into the background, beautiful, still, and symbolic. But the reality is far more nuanced and far more powerful. Ancient Egyptian queens were not just figures of visual splendor. They were living, breathing parts of the machinery of power. Their position was woven deeply into the spiritual and political framework of the kingdom. To the people, the queen represented not just the king's wife, but a conduit between the human world and the divine. She often embodied the goddess Hathor, the deity of motherhood, joy, and fertility. She might appear in temple ceremonies alongside the pharaoh, not as an accessory, but as a required presence to complete the ritual. The title Great Royal Wife was more than just a label. It was a statement of hierarchy and legitimacy. Among the many wives, a pharaoh might have political alliances, concubines, or secondary royal women. Only one could be great. And she didn't just manage household affairs. She influenced appointments. She mediated between court factions. She raised future kings. Let's talk about succession, one of the most fragile aspects of royal life. Ancient Egypt was built on order. Chaos was the enemy. And nothing invited chaos more than uncertainty about who the next ruler would be. Queens became the stabilizers of the throne. If a pharaoh died suddenly, it was the queen, often the mother of the heir, who stepped into the political vacuum. She might issue decrees in the name of a young king. She might gather support from temple officials or military generals. She might even rule openly as regent or co-regent. There are traces of this all over the historical record, even when names are missing. For example, after the death of Amenemhat I, it was the queen who likely brokered the transition for Senusret I. And in times when kings were weak or unpopular, it was sometimes the queen's public presence that reassured the people the gods still favoured the dynasty. The queen's power also extended beyond her family. Royal women often oversaw temple complexes, large economic estates, and administrative roles tied to the wealth of the kingdom. As God's wife of Amun, she had religious authority, especially in the later dynasties, where this title came with land, servants, and enormous prestige. In some periods, the god's wife was essentially a high priestess with near pharaonic independence. Yet much of this power lived in the shadows. Queens weren't supposed to be too visible, too vocal. The political culture valued quiet influence. A successful queen advised discreetly, manipulated loyally, and maintained the illusion of male dominance. But not all queens were content with the shadows. Take Queen Ahotep. She lived during a time of national crisis, the Hyksos invasion. While most of Egypt was fractured, she's believed to have rallied troops, protected Thebes, and may have even taken to the battlefield herself. Her funeral goods include ceremonial weapons, daggers, and battle axes, signs of a queen who was honored as a warrior, not just a wife. Then there's Queen Tiye, wife of Amenhotep III. She came from a non-royal background, yet rose to unprecedented prominence. Foreign leaders wrote to her directly. Her name appeared beside the king's in official monuments. She was not just a queen, she was a partner in rule. And of course, there's the mysterious Nefertiti. You'll hear more about her later, but for now, consider this. During her husband Akhenaten's radical religious revolution, she stood beside him as co-leader in religious and political iconography. She wasn't in the background, she was in the middle of it. The palace was a theatre, and queens knew how to play their part. But they also rewrote the script when necessary. And behind every carefully managed public image was a life of tension. Court politics were brutal, with multiple wives, scheming courtiers, jealous relatives, and power-hungry priests. The queen had to navigate a social maze. Loyalty was rarely guaranteed. Allies could become threats, and sons, so often the focus of a queen's strategy, could be used against her if power shifted the wrong way. There are stories, buried, whispered, half erased, of queens who fell from grace, some exiled, some assassinated, some forgotten deliberately. For every powerful queen remembered in stone, there are a dozen whose names survive only in fragments, if at all. Even tombs were contested. A queen's resting place wasn't guaranteed. If her reputation soured, her name might be chipped off her sarcophagus, her tomb might be looted or reused. Memory was sacred in Egypt, and erasing someone's name was the ultimate punishment. It meant denying them an afterlife, and yet some survived the erasure. Hatshepsut, for example, ruled as king and built a legacy so grand that later rulers tried to destroy it. Her name was chiseled off monuments, her statues broken, her titles reassigned, but stone remembers. And centuries later, her story rose again. Others left subtler legacies, a title passed down, a temple inscription, a statue hidden in a courtyard. Their stories may be fragmented, but they are still there, if you look. So what was it like to live as a queen in ancient Egypt? It was isolation and adoration, duty and danger, ceremony and competition, a life of immense pressure, symbolic power and constant risk. You were revered but watched, decorated but vulnerable, important until you weren't. But even now, thousands of years later, their influence lingers. In the stone corridors of Karnak, in the hidden chambers of tombs, in the records scratched onto pots and papyrus, long buried beneath sand and time. These women shaped dynasties, guarded the divine order, and whispered their wisdom into the ears of kings. They weren't always remembered, but they were never truly gone. And if you listen closely, quiet now, you can still hear them, not in the roar of battle, but in the steady heartbeat behind the throne. Chapter 2. Daughter of the Gods. In ancient Egypt, the queen was not merely a royal wife, she was a divine being, or at least something remarkably close to it. To rule Egypt was to embody order, ma'at, the balance between chaos and harmony, and just as the pharaoh was considered a living god, descended from Ra, chosen by the divine, it made sense that the queen too held sacred space in the spiritual cosmos. She was not just a consort, she was a bridge between heaven and earth. She stood at the intersection of family, politics, and the gods. Before she ever bore a child or advised her husband, a queen was often regarded as semi-divine by birth. Many were daughters or sisters of the pharaoh, linking dynasties through sacred bloodlines. The logic was simple: keep divine blood pure by keeping it in the family. But this was not just about status, it was theological. The queen was the living image of Hathor, goddess of love and motherhood, of Isis, protector and magician, of Mut, the primordial mother. In each temple carving, each statue, you see her, crowned not only in gold but in symbols of protection, healing and regeneration. Her power wasn't just ceremonial. In rituals, the queen took on roles critical to the health of the nation. She might anoint a sacred statue, offer incense, or reenact mythological scenes designed to renew the king's life force. These weren't performances, they were political necessities wrapped in spiritual tradition. If she failed, Egypt failed, and in that sacred choreography she wasn't merely participating, she was channeling the divine. In temple walls from Luxor to Karnak, queens are carved standing alongside gods, not behind them but beside them. In some depictions she nurses Horus, the divine child, just as Isis did. In others she plays the sistrum, invoking the power of Hathor to maintain joy and order in the world. In rare but powerful scenes, she embraces the king in a divine pose, passing strength from goddess to god. The public saw these images and believed not just in her piety but in her necessity. If the king was the sun, she was the fertile land it touched. Without her there was no life, no rebirth, no throne. The queen's identity was deeply intertwined with mythology. One of the most powerful associations came from Isis, the mother of Horus, the sister wife of Osiris. In the myth, Isis resurrects her murdered husband and protects their child until he can reclaim the throne. The parallels were not accidental. Queens were expected to be guardians of legacy, rebirth, and legitimacy, and in the eyes of the people, that made her a living myth. The deeper you dig into religious texts and temple inscriptions, the more often you find the queen's names woven into sacred language. She was not background, she was invocation. Her name was spoken in chants and inked in prayers. She was called on to bless the crops, to ease childbirth, to guard travelers. People believed that through her, the gods could hear them. And in return, queens often wielded their spiritual authority to influence state policy. A queen who controlled the temples, particularly of major gods like Amun, Mut, or Isis, controlled wealth, land, and influence. In a kingdom where religion and governance were two halves of the same coin, this meant power. In the later dynasties, the title God's Wife of Amun evolved from ceremonial honor to political force. These women were often unmarried daughters of pharaohs, dedicated to temple life. They ruled large estates, employed hundreds of priests and workers, and passed their title on through adoption, not marriage. In Thebes, their names were inscribed on buildings. Their decrees were respected by kings, and their existence blurred the lines between queen, priestess, and monarch. One such woman was Hatshepsut II. She ruled her temple estate with the authority of a king, had her own throne name, and even commissioned royal-style art of herself, performing divine rituals. While pharaohs shifted and fell in distant cities, she remained a stabilizing presence in Thebes for decades. Spiritual queenship was not just about presence, it was about performance. The people needed to see the queen in her sacred roles. During festivals like Oped, the queen would process with the king and sacred statues of gods, symbolizing divine renewal. These ceremonies reinforced her connection to the divine and reminded everyone of her vital role in maintaining cosmic order. But with divinity came expectation. To fail in these roles was not just a political misstep, it was cosmic imbalance. A queen who overstepped, who challenged traditional roles without divine justification, risked being painted as disruptive, heretical, or unnatural. This is why Hatshepsut's transformation into a king was so radical. She didn't simply claim the crown, she redefined the theology around it. She justified her rule not just politically, but spiritually, presenting herself as the daughter of the god Amun, chosen at birth to lead. She embraced the male regalia, but also emphasized her divine femininity. In her inscriptions, the gods speak of her as rightful ruler, not by blood, but by divine will. Her actions were bold, but her language, scripted in myth. Even queens who didn't rule as kings still leaned into divine symbolism. Nefertari, wife of Ramses II, was deified in her own right. In her tomb in the Valley of the Queens, she's depicted not as a mortal, but as a goddess walking among gods. The art is among the most breathtaking in Egypt, painted in vibrant colour, delicate lines, and a reverence that still stuns scholars today. Yet, the divine image often masked the human cost. Living as a goddess meant never resting, never aging, never faltering. A queen had to embody beauty, grace, fertility, wisdom, and do it all within the rules of divine expectation. If her husband failed, if crops failed, if the gods grew silent, it could all fall back on her. Many queens bore the weight quietly, others pushed back, a few rewrote the rules, but all walked a razor's edge, caught between reverence and responsibility, because to be divine in ancient Egypt was not to be free, it was to be seen, always. Even in the afterlife, this sacred duty continued. Queens were buried with elaborate rituals designed to carry them into the arms of the gods they once embodied. Their tombs were often smaller than those of kings, but filled with the same symbolism. Spells from the Book of the Dead, amulets of protection, offerings to nourish their ka. Some were buried near their husbands. Others, like Nefertari, were buried in tombs of their own, testaments to their individual sanctity. In every brushstroke and chisel mark you can see the reverence their society had for them, and you can also sense the effort it took to earn that reverence, because it was never freely given. It had to be performed, maintained, defended, even by goddesses. And so we're left with a picture of queens who weren't just partners, but power. Not just mothers, but myths. And as we leave this chapter of sacred duty and step closer to the halls of palace life, we'll see how that divinity translated into everyday control, political maneuvering, domestic strategy, and sometimes quiet rebellion, because being a goddess was only the beginning. The real challenge came inside the palace walls, where influence wasn't ceremonial, it was personal. And power, well, that had to be earned. Chapter 3. The making of a queen before the gold crowns, the painted eyes, and the carved relief showing queens standing beside gods. There was a girl, not born to silence or splendor, but to expectation. In ancient Egypt, a future queen's life didn't begin in the throne room. It started in a villa, a temple estate, or a noble's home. Sometimes she was born to royalty, other times to a powerful family with close ties to the court. Wherever her cradle stood, one thing was certain: she was not raised like other girls. Her lessons began early, reading and writing religious hymns, courtly behavior. She was taught how to speak to priests and listen to scribes, how to carry herself with poise, and how to blend into the background when necessary. She learned to read omens, pour libations, and recognize the symbols of gods and seasons. If her family had influence, she was taught diplomacy, how to speak to foreign envoys without speaking too much. But just as important as all this, she learned to watch. The court of Egypt was a mirror maze of alliances, rivalries, and secrets, and the women within it were often the keenest players. A girl destined for queenship had to learn which nods meant yes, and which meant wait. She had to study the way servants whispered, how scribes adjusted scrolls when pharaohs entered the room. Power didn't announce itself, it moved quietly, and so did she. By the time she reached adolescence, the shape of her destiny would start to take form. For daughters of the king, their futures were often decided before their first steps. Many were promised in marriage to solidify alliances, link bloodlines, or ensure continuity of divine rule. A royal princess might be betrothed to her half-brother, the crown prince, or in some cases to a much older relative, a sitting pharaoh whose need for a powerful alliance outweighed his concern for companionship. Marriage was not about love, it was about survival. To become queen, a girl had to be both suitable and strategic. Her beauty may have helped, but it was never enough. She had to be composed, discreet, and unwavering. She had to be ready to step into a life where every glance could be read and every word might echo beyond the walls of the palace. Her arrival at court was not celebrated with loud fanfare. It was a slow absorption into palace life. She moved into the harem palace, a misnamed structure that functioned more like a political ecosystem than a romantic retreat. Here, royal women lived, worked, and waited. Within the harem were layers of hierarchy. The great royal wife sat at the top. Beneath her were lesser wives, royal daughters, widows of previous kings, and foreign princesses. Every woman had a title, every role had its boundaries, and every day brought quiet tests. A new queen had to learn quickly. She studied the routines of the court, the times when audiences were held, the unspoken rules of which courtiers bowed deeper and which dared not to. She watched who the scribes favoured. She noticed which priests lingered near the king. She remembered the names of guards, the smells of incense during certain rituals, and the way her own attendants paused before answering questions. Her world became one of layers. Symbol on symbol, message hidden in gesture, and above it all she began to understand something both thrilling and terrifying. Power came in whispers. It was in the way the king turned to her during ceremonies, in the way her presence alone could change the tone of a gathering, in the way other wives suddenly adjusted their voices when she entered a room. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence could command attention. Still, it wasn't easy. Rivalry in the harem was a constant undercurrent. Other wives, some older, some more politically connected, had ambitions of their own. If her husband favoured her, she became a target. If she bore no sons, she became vulnerable. If she spoke too often, she became dangerous. The line between prominence and peril was razor thin, and yet the rewards were vast. A queen who played her cards right could secure her position, her child's future, and even extend her influence into temples and state affairs. She could advocate for allies, place family in positions of power, or shape the very legacy of the king's reign. But first, she had to survive. To be queen was to be prepared for everything. Joy was measured. Grief was hidden. A miscarriage could not be mourned in public. A betrayal could not be shouted down. Tears were for the bath chamber. Anger was for the gods. In public she was calm, graceful, almost divine, but in private she was sharp, observant, strategic. And she was always learning. Over time she developed her own network, attendants who listened more than they spoke, guards who owed her favours, priests who respected her rituals. Her influence didn't come all at once. It grew like roots in dry soil, slow and unseen but deep. If she bore a son, her position solidified. Mother of the heir. A title worth more than gold. With it came more responsibility. She managed his education, chose his tutors, monitored his friendships. She began preparing him for rule, even while his father still wore the crown. In moments when the king was away at war or retreating to distant temples, she might be called upon to handle affairs at court. And if the king died, that's when her true test began. Some queens faded into the background. Others, especially those whose sons were too young to rule, stepped forward as regents. In these rare but critical moments, a queen might sign official documents, hold court sessions, and command the loyalty of generals and priests alike. Her time in the shadows had taught her well, and if she ruled wisely, the people would remember her, not just as a consort, but as a leader. Her statues would be carved with care, her name written alongside the gods, and her story, if lucky, would survive the sand. Because to be queen in ancient Egypt was never guaranteed. It was to walk a path lined with whispers and thorns, to carry the crown behind the crown, to rule quietly until the world had no choice but to notice. And the next time we meet her, she's no longer learning. She's acting, steering, commanding without raising her voice. In the next chapter, we'll step into the palace, not as a guest, but through the queen's eyes, and see what really happens once the door is shut. Chapter 4. The Power Behind the Throne. To outsiders, the queen was a presence beside the king, quiet, beautiful, symbolic, a living adornment to the divine ruler of the two lands. But to those within the palace, and certainly to those behind its closed doors, the truth was far more complex. Queens in ancient Egypt didn't just sit beside power, they shaped it, directed it. In moments of crisis, they often held it in their own hands, and they did it without ever needing to raise their voice. In public, the pharaoh was the face of law, religion, and strength. But no man ruled alone, not truly. Behind every decision, every alliance, every ceremony carefully choreographed for the eyes of the people, there was influence, and in many cases that influence wore perfume and linen. Because while the king sat on the throne, the queen sat within the court, and her reach was longer than anyone dared admit aloud. Her power began at home. The private quarters of the palace were not just domestic spaces, they were nerve centers. Decisions made over evening meals or whispered beside the sleeping chamber could shift policies, appointments, or even determine a general's fate. Queens who knew how to listen and when to speak could turn the tide of entire court debates with a single observation. Some queens worked behind the scenes, facilitating alliances, shaping policies through counsel, or nudging the king's attention toward a loyal scribe or a trusted general. Others were far more direct. Queen Tiye, wife of Amenhotep III, is a prime example. She came from a non-royal background. Her parents were high-ranking nobles, but not of the bloodline, and yet she rose not only to the title of Great Royal Wife, but to an unprecedented level of public visibility and influence. Her name appeared alongside the king's in inscriptions. Her face was carved next to his in statuary, equal in size, something almost unheard of at the time. Foreign rulers addressed her directly in letters, and perhaps most telling of all, when her son Akhenaten came to power and radically altered Egypt's religion, Tiye remained a central figure at court, advising him during one of the most unstable periods in Egyptian history. Her influence was not an accident. It was cultivated, deliberate, and undeniable. Then there was Queen Ahotep, a royal matriarch during the turbulent period when the Hyksos ruled parts of Egypt. Historical clues suggest she rallied troops, commanded loyalty, and maintained stability while the next generation prepared for war. Her funeral artifacts include weapons, an honor rarely seen for women, and inscriptions praising her as one who pacified Upper Egypt. These weren't passive figures. They were stabilizers, diplomats, strategists. Queens held sway over internal court politics as well. The king's council, priests, generals, scribes, may not have been commanded by her, but many owed her their positions. Through a single word to her husband, she could shape the balance of favor. Appointments, gifts, alliances, these were currencies she controlled with care. A clever queen also built her own network. She placed loyal family members in key roles. She supported scribes who reported directly to her. She cultivated temple officials whose prayers ensured her spiritual authority, and often whose treasury ensured her financial independence. When the king trusted her, her access was unmatched. She read the same scrolls, heard the same diplomatic reports, and often met foreign visitors herself. But even when the king was distant or distracted, her work continued, especially through diplomacy. While men drafted treaties and sent envoys, queens handled something subtler, marriage diplomacy. Foreign princesses brought into the harem often entered through the queen's care. She decided their place in the hierarchy. She could welcome or isolate them, and in doing so, she influenced foreign perceptions of Egypt's royal court. In some periods, queens even acted as go-betweens in international disputes. Letters from foreign kings survive in which they petitioned Egyptian queens directly, knowing that her voice carried weight in matters of peace or war. And yet all of this had to be done without seeming to threaten the king's supremacy. Her influence had to remain just shy of command. Her voice strong but never louder than his. Even her public appearances were managed carefully. In festivals she walked behind the pharaoh. In rituals she offered second. But to the educated observer the symbolism was clear. Without her presence the cycle of kingship was incomplete. In the new kingdom, the image of the great royal wife evolved into something nearly priestly. She was the queen not just of a man, but of the state, a living link between the palace and the temple, and yet in times of succession her role became something more. When the pharaoh died, chaos lurked. If the heir was young, untested or contested, the queen became the gatekeeper of legacy. She might act as regent, issuing decrees in her son's name. She might gather allies, remove threats, or preserve the fiction of continuity while she handled the reality of crisis. The story of Hatshepsut is perhaps the most famous example of this shift in power. Originally regent for her stepson Thutmose III, she eventually assumed full kingship. Her inscriptions carefully explained the divine support for her rule. She wasn't stealing the throne, she said. She was chosen by Amun himself. Her transformation was both political and spiritual. She dressed as a man, wore the false beard of the pharaoh, and ordered statues that portrayed her in full male regalia. But she never gave up her queenly titles either. She was both. And her reign was marked by prosperity, diplomacy, and grand building projects that still stand today. Of course, power did not protect her legacy. Later kings tried to erase her memory, chisel away her name, destroy her statues, write her out of history, but the stone remembered, and so do we. Many queens who didn't rule directly still left lasting marks. Mutnojmet, Nefertari, Ankhesenamun. Each navigated the court with grace and strategy, shaping the politics of their era without ever wearing the double crown. Their power lay not in titles, but in presence, in access, in influence. A queen's power was soft but never weak. It flowed around the edges of the throne like the Nile around its banks, slow, wide, steady, and just as essential. Because while kings may have ruled the land, queens ruled the court. And the court, that was where futures were made. In the next chapter, we'll step away from the politics and into something more intimate. What did queens do when the doors were closed? How did they live, dress, speak, pray? We'll leave the throne room now and enter the palace itself. Because behind the power was still a woman, and her world was no less complex. Chapter 5. Behind the Power. A queen was never just a symbol in Egypt. She was a presence, calculated, deliberate, and woven into the structure of the state. To be queen was not to rest beside the throne. It was to shape what the throne did, and the world knew it. The palace might have whispered of kings, but its heartbeat was hers. Every gesture she made was watched. Every alliance she approved, every feast she hosted, every fabric she wore, it all mattered. In Egypt, appearance wasn't decoration, it was politics, and the queen knew exactly how to use it. Some did it quietly, others did not. There were queens who influenced the direction of the empire through whispers behind latticed doors, and then there were those like Tiye, who wrote letters to foreign rulers under her own seal, who stood as advisor to kings, and who was feared and respected across borders. She wasn't just married to power, she was power. Other queens wielded religious authority as leverage. When the gods walked in ceremony, it was the queen who guided them. She embodied divine roles, served as high priestess, and led rituals meant to secure the order of the world. A few went further. One claimed the throne outright, wore the beard, sat in the king's place. Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh, not hidden behind a boy king, not waiting for a regent's role to end, but as the sovereign of Upper and Lower Egypt. She reshaped temples, sent trading fleets down the Red Sea, and left monuments that outlasted dynasties. Her story was nearly erased, but stone remembers. And there were others. Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one has come, was more than beauty. She appeared in scenes of worship alone, alongside the king as equal, and sometimes instead of him. Her image adorns walls not as consort, but as divine bridge between humans and gods. Rumors suggest she may have ruled alone for a time under a different name. The truth remains buried, but the suggestion is enough. These weren't outliers. They were part of a pattern, women who navigated a world designed to contain them, and instead defined it. Power was not always dramatic. Often it was quiet, a changed advisor, a redirected caravan, a marriage arranged just so, a policy edited behind closed doors, and it was strategic. Queens learned early when to speak and when to remain silent. They knew when a gift could carry more weight than an order. They understood how to turn obligation into opportunity. They built coalitions within the harem, a word that meant place of sacred women, not hidden concubines. It was a political sphere, a network of noble families, a council of influence. The queen sat at its center, the anchor in a system of alliances. She knew who favored whom, who envied whom, and how to keep it balanced. Every offering, every banquet, every festival was a statement. She honored gods to remind the court who kept divine favor. She managed estates to remind the economy who was watching. She received foreign envoys with grace and steel, often being the first to sense opportunity or danger. Some queens outlived their kings and became power brokers in succession battles. Their knowledge of lineage, loyalty, and inheritance could turn the tide between civil war and a peaceful coronation. Others ruled alongside their sons as king's mother, a title that carried both ceremonial weight and daily authority. A son might wear the crown, but his mother knew how to wield it, and while men might have built walls around their power, queens often built bridges across it. They didn't always get credit, but they always left fingerprints. In the next chapter, we step into the queen's private world, her court, her inner circle, her carefully curated space of influence and intimacy, because power isn't just held in public, it's built in private. Chapter 6. The Queen's Court. Beyond the towering pylons and gilded statues of Egypt's great temples, behind the lattice work of palace corridors and shadowed courtyards, lay the hidden engine of royal life, the Queen's Court. It was not the throne room where kings made law, nor the temples where gods were honored in ceremony. It was a world unto itself, tucked within the labyrinth of stone and linen, fragrant oils and whispered counsel. This was where the queen ruled in practice, if not in name, not with scepters or decrees, but with influence, with presence, with grace sharpened into strategy. To walk the halls of her court was to enter a space where politics wore perfume, and every conversation carried the weight of possibility. Here the queen was not merely the king's companion, she was the centre of her own universe, one that radiated out in layers of power, ritual, and human connection. Within her domain, the queen's presence was constant yet rarely ostentatious. Her court did not thunder with pronouncements. It hummed with motion, quiet footsteps across polished stone, the rustle of linen robes, the soft murmur of strategy shared between attendants. Everyone in this world knew their place, and everyone knew hers. She rose early. Dawn filtered through lattice windows, golden and soft, while handmaidens prepared her oils and cosmetics. They recited the day's schedule in hushed tones, visits from temple envoys, meetings with estate managers, ceremonial audiences, and perhaps a private dinner with the king, if he was not away or otherwise occupied. But make no mistake, even alone she ruled her day. Her steward was her anchor, a man or woman of meticulous discipline who handled correspondence, allocations, and the rhythm of household life. It was the steward who delivered news first, who knew which scribe had been sloppy and which rival wife had ordered new jewellery. Through the steward's updates, the queen stayed one step ahead of everyone who thought they were clever. Attendants came and went in a dance as old as court life itself. Some stayed silent, others brought tidings. A servant girl might carry gossip hidden within a bowl of figs. A palace guard might cough twice before speaking a name. Subtle signals governed every interaction, and the queen, raised from childhood to read faces before scrolls, saw everything. There were women who orbited her too. Some trusted companions, others ladies-in-waiting from noble houses, given as a gesture of alliance and obligation. Together they created a web of whispers that extended across the palace walls. They watched each other, they watched her, they passed messages not with words but with timing. A glance held too long, a gesture paused at the wrong moment. This was not idle pageantry, it was survival. In her gardens, private and jealously guarded, she might walk among perfumed myrrh trees and lotus pools, but even solitude was calculated. She did not simply stroll. She was seen, she was available. A visitor might approach with a casual remark that turned into a request. A letter might be placed on a tray alongside dates and wine. Nothing was without intention. And though she rarely left the palace complex, the world came to her. Foreign envoys brought gifts to win favour, bolts of dyed cloth, ivory combs, polished carnelian jewellery. Noble women from distant cities asked to observe her court and learn its customs. Musicians performed in her honour, scribes read poetry aloud, and dancers mimed sacred myths by flickering torchlight. The queen accepted these tributes with a gaze that never gave too much. Her approval could elevate a household. Her disinterest could end ambitions before they began. She rarely made demands. She didn't need to. The most powerful signal she could send was to say nothing at all. Yet, for all its elegance, the court could be a battlefield. Rivals, particularly other royal wives, maneuvered for access and influence. Daughters of generals, temple priestesses, and foreign princesses watched her closely. If she showed weakness, they would move. Sometimes alliances shifted with the turn of a season. A trusted advisor might fall from grace. A loyal handmaid might disappear after a single mistake. Nothing was permanent, nothing was truly safe, but she knew how to command. She rewarded discretion. She prized those who brought her useful secrets, not praise. She remembered birthdays, family names, the illness of a servant's sister, not out of softness, but precision. It made her indispensable. It made her dangerous. If a dispute arose in the women's quarters over land, jewellery, or the loyalty of a guard, she resolved it swiftly and without public insult. If a lesser wife demanded recognition, she could grant it with a gesture or let the silence swallow the question whole. No decree was written, but her will became law just the same. Behind closed doors, she was mother too. If she had daughters, she prepared them for this life, teaching them not just how to dress or speak, but how to observe, how to calculate, how to disappear when it suited them. If she had sons, she knew she walked a sharper edge. The boy was future royalty. That made him both her greatest treasure and greatest liability. Every touch, every lesson, every favour shown to him was recorded, analysed, judged. A queen who loved her son too openly might be accused of manipulating the line of succession. A queen who was too cold risked losing his loyalty. Her motherhood was monitored with more scrutiny than her prayers. And still, she endured. Her court extended beyond the palace gates, through temple lands and estate villages. She oversaw the distribution of grain. She received petitions from landowners. She advised temple elders when disputes arose. Her reach was far, her network dense. Yet in the scrolls of history her name was rarely the one carved first. That didn't matter to her because she knew the truth. She knew how many fires she had quietly extinguished. How many ceremonies flowed smoothly because she had rearranged the guest list. How many children slept in safety because she had sent word to a distant province or bribed a scribe to lose a report. She knew the number of marriages she arranged, the alliances she maintained, the betrayals she anticipated before they could bloom. The Queen's court was never chaos, not because the world outside was peaceful, but because she managed it so skillfully no one ever saw the edges fray. In time, when her hair silvered and her name faded from the top of scrolls, her court still echoed with her memory. The walls whispered her phrases. Her steward trained the next. Her handmaidens passed her stories to daughters of new queens. And some nights, in the candle-lit silence of the inner sanctum, a new queen would sit in her place and wonder, how did she do it? How did she hold everything together? And perhaps if she listened closely enough, the answer would come, not in voice, but in rhythm, in the soft cadence of footsteps, in the remembered scent of myrrh, in the feeling of walking, not in someone's shadow, but along her path. Chapter 7. The Queen Who Became Pharaoh. There are moments in history when tradition cracks, when expectations give way to something bold, unexpected, and utterly transformative. In ancient Egypt, one such moment arrived not with a trumpet blast or celestial sign, but with a woman stepping forward into the place no woman was supposed to stand. She did not wait to be asked. She did not simply preserve the throne for a son or brother or nephew. She became the throne. It began slowly, as most revolutions do. A king died, the court grieved, the rituals were performed, the statues covered in linen, and the halls filled with morning incense. The heir was young, too young to rule alone. Custom dictated that the queen step in as regent, a caretaker of power until the rightful ruler came of age. But she had seen too much, heard too many promises, known too well what happened to women who waited. She didn't just act as regent, she claimed authority, and then she didn't give it back. First came the subtle changes. Her name, already known to the court, began to appear more frequently in official documents. Then came titles, royal epithets usually reserved for kings, and then, one day, the most shocking transformation of all. Her image appeared on a temple wall, not as queen, not as mother, but as ruler. Male regalia, royal beard, the double crown of unified Egypt. The message was clear. She was no longer merely protecting the throne, she was it, and she ruled with absolute clarity. This wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Egypt's divine monarchy wasn't built to share space. A woman had to step outside of womanhood to be accepted as ruler. She had to become a god-king, not a god-queen. So she changed the language, changed the imagery, changed how the people saw her. Every ritual she performed was now for the gods as king. Every decree bore the full weight of pharaonic authority. She led temple ceremonies, ordered military campaigns, oversaw taxes, sent delegations, and built. Oh, did she build! Temples rose from sand, obelisks shot skyward, colossal statues bore her image, firm-jawed and serene. Her building projects became a statement in stone. Permanence, divinity, vision, the people accepted it, perhaps they even welcomed it. The floodwaters came, the granaries were full, the priests were paid. Egypt was steady and steadiness was divine. But within the court, not all hearts were steady. There were murmurs. From conservative advisers, from discontented relatives, from distant provinces where old power brokers waited for weakness. They said her rule was unnatural, said the gods had not meant for a woman to wield the crook and flail, said the kingdom would suffer under her hands. They waited for her to fail, but she didn't. She ruled not through fear but intelligence, not by crushing rivals but by outmaneuvering them. She didn't silence opposition. She surrounded it with competence until it starved. She relied on loyal advisers, many of whom had served her as queen. Their faith in her didn't come from awe, it came from memory. They remembered who had made decisions in the king's final years, who had carried the weight of diplomacy, who had smoothed tensions in the harem, calmed the temples, protected the borders. They had always served her. Now the titles finally matched the truth, and her people, they had seen kings bring ruin before. They had seen sons unready, fathers unwise, brothers unworthy. They saw in her something Egypt valued above all else: order. She gave them order and beauty and ritual. She gave them the gods, and in return she asked for no forgiveness. Still, she knew it would not last forever. No rain does. The young heir grew. His supporters watched the calendar. And behind the walls the wheels of succession turned with slow inevitability. She didn't cling to power like a tyrant. She held it like a steward who knows exactly how fragile peace can be. And when the time came, she disappeared from record, not suddenly but gradually. Her name was chiseled out of walls, her statues were altered. Her memory was folded into the pages of history, half remembered, half erased. It was not shame, it was fear. Her example was too powerful. She had proved it could be done, that a woman alone, with no divine prince beside her, could rule the mightiest empire on earth, and rule it well. That truth frightened those who came after more than any army ever could. But stone remembers. The walls she raised still stand. The temples still bear her likeness, if you know where to look. The monuments whisper her story, even when names are gone. And what was once erased was slowly uncovered, by dust, time, and persistence. Today her legacy endures, not because she was loud, not because she demanded it, but because she ruled. And Egypt, even when it tried to forget her, could not undo what she built. So when you walk through the sunlit halls of her temple, or stand beneath the shadow of her obelisks, remember, she wasn't meant to rule, but she did. And every stone she left behind dares you to ask why she ever had to ask. Chapter 8. Motherhood and the Throne. To the world she was a queen, poised, adorned, graceful under the weight of titles and responsibility. But within the inner sanctum of the palace, behind the incense and jewels, her most sacred and perilous role was something no inscription dared to simplify. She was a mother, not merely the giver of life, but the maker of kings. And in ancient Egypt, where bloodlines mattered more than borders and legacy stretched further than stone, motherhood wasn't just a family affair. It was a political gamble. Her womb was a treasury, her children, the currency of survival. And every decision she made as a parent had the weight of 1,000 eyes watching. Priests prayed over her pregnancies, courtiers gossiped about her fertility, rivals whispered about every miscarriage, every absence, every silence. Because a queen's ability to bear children, especially sons, could determine the balance of an empire. And her failure, even imagined, could destroy her. From the moment her pregnancy was confirmed, she ceased to be just a woman. She became a vessel, watched, weighed, advised, and guarded. Her diet changed, her schedule altered. Her very breath became a matter of ritual. She was surrounded by midwives, nurses, and priestesses, each one tasked with ensuring the safe passage of a future ruler. Offerings were made in her name. Amulets placed beneath her mattress. Statues of Taweret, the goddess of childbirth, were set beside her bed, their squat, hippo-shaped forms a strange comfort in a world where childbirth was a miracle, balanced on a knife's edge. The palace held its breath. And when the child came, if the child came, her relief was never private. If it was a daughter, she smiled through the disappointment, even if her heart ached. A daughter could become a powerful ally, could marry well, could serve the temple. But it wasn't the answer the kingdom hoped for. If it was a son, the world changed overnight. Her title shifted, her status soared. She became more than queen, she became mother of the heir. And with that came both reverence and risk, because now her child was not just her own, he was Egypt's. He was watched by priests, guarded by scribes, trained by generals. She had to share him with a court that never truly slept, and while she was his mother, she was also his first line of defense. Others would try to reach him, to teach him differently, to twist his loyalties. Every nursemaid she hired, every teacher she approved, every toy he touched had to be carefully considered. She loved him fiercely, but strategically. She told him stories of the gods, not just to soothe his sleep, but to shape his soul. She corrected his posture, not for pride, but for politics. A boy with slouched shoulders might look weak. A prince with weak perception might be manipulated. Her parenting wasn't tender, it was vigilant. She trained him in kindness, but also in suspicion, in piety, but also in power. Because she knew, more than anyone, what the court could do to a king who didn't rule wisely. And if she failed, the punishment wouldn't just be personal, it would be national. But what if she bore more than one son? Then the dance became even more delicate. Favourites were forbidden. Comparisons were lethal. One child could inherit the throne, the other might inherit ambition, and with it a host of dangerous allies. A wrong word, an unintended glance, a second son treated as first, it could set an entire dynasty on fire. So she walked a narrow line, equal praise, equal training, equal meals, and yet the court still speculated, they always did, because the queen's children were more than kin. They were pawns, symbols, bargaining chips. A daughter might be promised to a neighbouring ruler, securing peace with a bracelet and a vow. A younger son might be sent to the temple, cloaked in divinity, removed from politics. Every child was assigned a path. Few chose their own, but the queen never stopped watching. She followed their education, read their tutors' reports, noted which servant they favoured, which gods they prayed to, which games they played too often. She tracked their temperaments like a general mapping terrain, because she wasn't just raising humans, she was shaping history, and sometimes history resisted. There were illnesses, fevers, accidents, a fall from a horse, a wrong herb in the evening stew. No one ever said the word out loud, but the implication lingered. Sabotage, poison, treachery. Every time a child fell ill, the palace tightened its defences. The queen clutched at prayers and physicians, commanding, pleading, commanding again. She paced the corridors at night, knuckles white, listening for news. And when the child recovered, if the child recovered, she celebrated in private. Publicly, she maintained composure, because a crying queen was a weak queen, and a weak queen invited chaos. If she lost a child, the mourning was masked in ritual. A black sash, a sacrifice, a speech but not a tear, not where anyone could see, because grief, like love, had to be managed carefully. And if her son ascended the throne, her role shifted again. She was no longer the centre of the palace, but she was not removed. She was an oracle, a counsellor, a memory of power that refused to fade. She might guide him from behind a curtain, advising on matters of succession, of trust, of mercy. She might broker marriages, endorse generals, visit temples in his name. She knew the old alliances, the ancient grudges. Her voice still carried weight, even if it came in whispers. But not all sons were grateful. Some saw her guidance as meddling, others as threat. And when a new queen arrived, young, eager, ready to claim her own court, things could shift quickly. Rooms were reassigned, guards replaced, rituals adjusted. The Queen Mother learned discretion anew. She offered advice only when asked. She stepped aside during ceremonies. She smiled through irrelevance, knowing that her true power lay not in appearances, but in what she had taught him long ago. Sometimes he remembered, sometimes he didn't, but always she remained the mother behind the throne, the voice behind the voice. And if the kingdom survived, if the temple stood, the borders held, the granaries stayed full, then she had succeeded. Even if her name never appeared in the official histories, even if her tomb was modest, even if her statues were carved only as consort, never as king, because she had raised an empire and that was legacy enough. Chapter 9. The Queen's Final Journey. She had worn crowns, whispered counsel, survived rivalries, and shaped the course of empires. She had brought life into the world and watched over it from behind veils of linen and incense. But no queen, no matter how beloved or powerful, could escape the last rite of passage, death. And for a queen of ancient Egypt, death was not a conclusion. It was a transformation, a crossing from one sacred role into another. If she had lived well, ruled wisely, and honored the gods, she would not simply fade into memory. She would rise into myth, take her place among the eternal, and ensure her spirit, her ka, lived on through statues, stories, and offerings. But the journey was long, and for many queens the path to immortality began long before their final breath. Her tomb was her insurance policy against decay, against obscurity, against the silence of history. It was commissioned not after death, but during life. Sometimes in her middle years, sometimes even earlier. Designs were drawn by master builders, sacred texts were consulted. The location itself, whether beside a husband, inside a valley, or deep beneath a pyramid, was debated with the same seriousness as a marriage contract. She might walk through it once while still living, a strange rehearsal, half spiritual, half practical. She would check the chambers, inspect the reliefs, nod at the scenes of offering and rebirth carved into walls. It was unsettling but necessary. To leave it to others was to risk your soul wandering lost. Her body would one day rest there, yes, but more importantly, so would her story. Funerary art captured not how she died, but how she wished to be remembered. a queen with arms outstretched, receiving offerings from her children, a serene figure before Osiris weighed against the feather of Maat. Scenes of feasting, scenes of worship, scenes of eternal beauty, and always her name, repeated in ink and stone, because in Egypt to speak the name was to keep the soul alive. Around her tomb, an army of objects assembled. There were Shabti figures, tiny carved workers meant to serve her in the afterlife. There were jars of perfume, bowls of grain, bolts of cloth and game boards. There were combs, rings, cosmetics, and sometimes letters, written by loved ones or officials tucked in with hope or guilt or gratitude. Everything she might need to continue living on the other side. But not all tombs were equal. If her husband died first, her burial might be funded by the new ruler. Sometimes this meant wealth. Other times it meant delays, compromises, half-finished reliefs. If her son ruled, he might elevate her tomb, carve more names, commission temples in her honor, or, he might not. Politics lingered even in death. A powerful queen was always at risk of being diminished by her successors. Names chiseled out, images altered, stories rewritten, but still, she planned, she left instructions, paid priests, bound spells into scrolls. The Book of the Dead was not just a manual, it was a weapon, a shield, a roadmap through a perilous afterlife full of trials, crocodile-headed demons, gates guarded by fire, and the dreaded Hall of Judgment. There, her heart would be weighed against the feather of truth. Too heavy and she'd be devoured. Balanced and she'd live forever. So she prepared. She lived well, honoured Maat, gave offerings, treated servants with justice, at least outwardly. She corrected lies. She prayed. She commissioned temples and donated to shrines, because one day she would stand before the gods and her deeds would be the only currency she could offer. When death finally came, the palace shifted into a hushed frenzy. Her body was wrapped in linen, layer by layer, with amulets nestled between folds. An ankh for life, an eye of Horus for protection, a scarab over the heart to keep it silent before judgment. Her funeral procession was both sacred and theatrical. Priests walked first, chanting hymns and burning incense. Her children followed, daughters veiled, sons solemn, their heads bowed beneath golden bands. Behind them came officials, mourners, musicians with sistrums, and dancers who twirled in ritual arcs, meant to please the spirits. Behind all of them, the people, those who had never seen her but who felt the tremor of her passing. Merchants, scribes, midwives, elders, children, all watching as she was carried through the city one last time. She was not just being buried, she was becoming divine. In some cases, queens were worshipped after death, not as full deities, but as intermediaries, saints, figures of reverence. Offerings were made at their tombs. Pilgrims came with petitions. In time, some queens became more famous in death than they had been in life, but for others, death was quiet. Their tombs modest, their names forgotten by generations too busy to remember. Some were buried in haste. Some were buried in glory, some were reburied years later, their bodies moved, their artifacts stolen or repurposed. And yet, even in bones and dust, the story lingered, because Egypt respected death more than any living empire. It understood that the end was not the end. The queen's tomb became her palace, her sarcophagus, her throne, her name, if it survived, her immortality. And if she was lucky, if the priests continued their prayers, if the walls remained intact, if her image was not erased, she would cross safely into the field of reeds. There, in a perfect mirror of life, she would live forever, eating, laughing, reuniting, in gardens that never withered, with lovers who never aged. With children she might have lost too soon. There was peace there, and justice, and memory. And so she waited, wrapped in linen and mystery, surrounded by the echoes of her reign, hoping the world above would remember, hoping her story would not be silenced. And though many queens were forgotten, some weren't. Some rose again through the work of scribes, scholars, and desert winds that peeled back the sand to reveal a name. A statue, a cartouche, a story whispered down 4,000 years of silence, and in that rediscovery, in that breath of recognition, she lived again, not in flesh, but in memory. Because for a queen of Egypt, death was never the end. It was a beginning. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Queens. Time is not kind to memory. Kings rise and fall, names fade from stone, temples crumble into sand. Yet even across the distance of millennia, the presence of Egypt's queens remains, etched into reliefs, whispered through myths, and woven into the very shape of the Nile's ancient rhythm. Their legacy is not always obvious, it doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits quietly in the shadows, hidden in architecture, preserved in symbols, encoded into titles once considered mere formality. But make no mistake, the queens of ancient Egypt did not vanish when their breath ceased or their tombs were sealed. They lingered, they influenced, they endured, and their legacy continues to shape how we understand power, womanhood, and history itself. Their faces may be weathered, their names sometimes scratched from monuments, but their influence is unmistakable. In temple architecture, their presence remains. Columns still rise beneath ceilings painted with stars, many paid for with a queen's treasury, overseen by her scribes and designed to reflect her vision of the cosmos. The positioning of a shrine, the orientation of a hall, the dedication of a statue, all silently speak of queens who once walked there. In literature, their names became metaphors. A wise woman might be called as clever as a queen, a beautiful one favored by Hathor. Myths evolved, and while many blurred over time, fragments of queens appeared as priestesses, goddesses, and even villains, proof that their stories clung to memory in ways no decree could fully erase. Titles given to women for centuries echoed ancient roles. The Great One of the House, or Mistress of the Two Lands, once meant queen. Later they meant noblewoman or high priestess or matriarch. Language changed, but the echoes remained, and those echoes stretched far beyond Egypt's borders. In neighboring empires, Nubia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, the presence of Egyptian queens was felt through diplomacy and image. Painted likenesses were shared. Golden gifts inscribed with their names crossed the desert. Daughters were married off to secure peace, but the queens who sent them embedded their legacy into foreign courts. Their impact was not limited to their own lives. Many influenced religious customs long after they were gone. Some were posthumously deified, their images added to temple reliefs centuries after burial. Others had annual festivals held in their honor. Priests read prayers for their spirits, hoping that by praising the queen, they might win favor with the divine. Even commoners remembered them. They named their daughters after them. They prayed at their tombs. They believed a queen could intercede in their suffering, that her wisdom, her motherhood, her proximity to the gods made her a sacred ally in times of need. That belief endured even when the queen's story was lost. In some ways, that was her greatest triumph, because legacy isn't just monuments, it's how people feel your absence. Centuries after a queen was buried, her image might be rediscovered, half buried in a temple wall or hidden beneath paint or reduced to a single line on a shattered stela. And still, when that image was seen, someone felt something. Awe, reverence, recognition. That is legacy. For some queens, their contributions outlived even dynasties. One built trade routes that remained open for generations. Another reformed rituals still performed by priests 200 years later. One queen's royal policies were adopted by her great-grandson. Another's tomb style became the blueprint for every noblewoman who followed. And for those whose legacies were nearly erased, who had their names struck out by successors, their statues defaced, their titles reassigned, there was still something stubbornly enduring in their story, because you can scratch out a name. But you cannot scratch out an idea, the idea that a woman could rule, that she could advise, govern, command armies, lead festivals, construct temples, and steer a civilization through famine or war or peace. That idea didn't die. It lived in every girl told she was strong, in every woman who lit a lamp and whispered to a queen she'd never met, in every scribe who dared record a story that others told him to forget. Even modern archaeologists have felt it. In dusty tombs, under scorching suns, they've knelt beside shattered statues and fragments of jewelry and broken jars, and known, somehow, that they were not alone, that they were standing in the shadow of someone whose presence never truly left. That is the legacy of queens. It's not clean, not linear, not always fair, but it is alive in museums and classrooms, in novels and documentaries, in lectures and lullabies. She lives through the stone she commissioned, through the law she shaped, through the empire she helped hold together with hands no less capable than any pharaoh's. And as long as her name is spoken, even in curiosity, even in wonder, she lives again. So when you walk through a gallery and see the painted face of a queen, or when you read about a woman who ruled beside the Nile and wonder how she did it, remember, her story is not over, because you're still listening, and that means she's still speaking. Chapter 11. Queens in Myth and Mystery. History remembers names, myth remembers impressions. For queens of ancient Egypt, those two often blurred. Some were real, flesh and bone, crown and linen. Others were whispers. Women who might have ruled, might have plotted, might have prayed in secret halls beneath temple stones. And then there were those who became more than rulers. They became legends. Their stories weren't written in scrolls or carved into stelae. They were carried in lullabies, hinted at in half-remembered chants, painted into murals where their names were long forgotten, but their eyes still watched from stone. These queens, real or imagined, remind us that legacy isn't always built on truth. Sometimes it's built on wonder, and no civilization loved wonder quite like Egypt. In the myths that drifted through the markets and temple courtyards, queens were not just consorts or mothers. They were dream walkers, magic workers, warriors in shadow. Some were said to speak to animals, others to the gods themselves. A tale told at a village fire pit spoke of a queen who turned into a cobra to protect her son. Another told of a woman with golden eyes who summoned the Nile's floodwaters with a single whispered prayer. There were stories of queens who cursed their rivals with honeyed wine, and others who could command sleep from miles away. No official history book recorded these things, but the people believed them, not because they were fact, but because they felt true. And feeling in Egypt was a kind of memory. Some stories may have grown from fragments of real lives. A queen who administered a temple might be remembered as a priestess with divine favor. A woman who ruled during a time of drought might become the queen who fought the sun god himself to bring the rains. Exaggeration, of course, but also tribute, because myth was how ordinary people honored extraordinary lives. Sometimes a queen's absence from official records only amplified the mystery. Why was her name scratched from a tomb wall? Why was her statue buried upside down in a temple's foundation? Why were there stories of a ruler with no cartouche? The answers were rarely clear. But speculation bred stories, and stories became belief. In one myth, a queen was born from lotus blossoms and could not be seen unless bathed in moonlight. In another, she walked the night disguised as a commoner, delivering wisdom to women in dreams. In yet another, she died in childbirth, but rose each dawn with the sun, reborn in the arms of Ra. Some queens were confused with goddesses, Hathor, Isis, Sekhmet. Their images overlapped, their temples echoed the same hymns. A worshipper might pray to one and mean the other, and perhaps in spirit they were the same. In Thebes, a ruined relief shows a female figure with arms outstretched over a pharaoh, not beside him but above. Was she his queen, his mother, his guardian? No one knows, but the pose suggests protection, authority, power beyond her station. Archaeologists argue over details. Storytellers never needed to. They simply said she watched over him, even in death, and that was enough. Even in more modern times, the mystery continues. A mummified woman buried with royal trappings but no identifying mark. A temple wall with a partially chiseled name, feminine in form, erased by someone afraid of what it once meant. Jewelry inscribed with titles no man ever used. Each discovery is a question. Was she a ruler, a regent, a rebel, a sorceress? The truth is rarely whole, but that doesn't make it less meaningful. The power of queens lies not only in what they did, but in what we imagine they could have done. Because imagination keeps history alive. In myths, queens are never weak. They bend winds, tame crocodiles, defy gods. They do what the living couldn't. They offer hope, vengeance, justice. They whisper that maybe, just maybe, the world could be different. And in that whisper is power. Because while kings are remembered for what they built, queens are remembered for how they made people feel. A sense of awe, a sense of fear, a sense that someone, somewhere, once held the world in her hands and didn't need to shout to prove it. So yes, some of these stories are likely fiction, but fiction is just truth in disguise. A truth that says she mattered, that she inspired, that someone thought she was worth remembering, even when memory failed. That's the quiet triumph of myth. It doesn't need evidence, it needs only to endure. And these queens, whether real, forgotten, or reborn in firelight stories, have endured. Because history is not a clean record, it's a broken mirror. And sometimes the most powerful reflections are found in the cracks. Chapter 12. What still remains, sand covers. Time forgets, stone erodes, but not everything is lost. Somewhere along the Nile, in a half-collapsed temple no longer visited by tourists or priests, a cartouche remains. Its edges worn, its symbols faint. It holds the name of a queen. No one speaks her name aloud anymore. No one knows her story. But her mark is still there, carved into the rock like a whisper that refused to die. That is what remains, not the full picture, not the perfect biography, but fragments. Enough to remind us that she existed, that she mattered, that somewhere in the vast and complicated sprawl of history, a woman stood at the edge of power and stepped forward. This is not just a story about Egypt, it's not just a story about royalty, it's a story about presence, about defiance, about the will to be seen. Walk through any museum holding Egyptian artifacts and you'll find the queen, not always at first glance, but she's there, in a ring barely wider than your fingernail, in a limestone fragment with a faint eye still outlined in coal, in a mirror polished smooth centuries ago by hands just like yours. You see her in the ways we still talk about power. You feel her in the way we remember what wasn't meant to be remembered. You understand her not because you've read every tablet or visited every ruin, but because you've seen how silence fights to erase and how memory fights back. There's something breathtaking about a life that insists on being found, despite time, despite damage, despite history's tendency to focus on kings and battles and borders. The queens of Egypt were not meant to be central. Many were not meant to be recorded, some were actively erased, but the fact that we still speak of them, that we are even now asking who they were, what they did, what they felt, is its own kind of resurrection, because the truth is they were not mythical. They were not footnotes, they were architects of dynasties, managers of courts, stewards of culture and mirrors of divine will. And they were human, they bled, they feared, they hoped, they lived lives full of complication, contradiction and compromise. They were not all saints, not all rebels, not all rulers. Some were gentle, some were ruthless. Some were content to stay in the background, others carved their way to the front. But each of them changed something, a law, a ritual, a memory, an expectation, a son, a nation. And that is what still remains. Their names are scratched into alabaster bowls, their shadows stretched down palace halls. Their choices still echo in how we define power, womanhood, divinity, even today. And so, as you read this, you're part of the story too. You are part of the continuation. Every time someone asks, who was she? Every time a statue is dusted off or a papyrus examined, or a little girl is told that yes, a woman did rule the most powerful kingdom on earth, that is what remains. Not just stone, not just history, but wonder. We will never know everything. We will never fill every gap, but maybe that's the point. Maybe the silence leaves room for us to imagine, to search, to care, and that, above all, is what these queens deserve. Not a perfect memory, but a living one. They are not gone, they are simply waiting. And now you know where to find them. In the shimmer of a museum case, in the faded line of a cartouche, in the name that survived 4,000 years of wind and fire and forgetting. She was here, she was real. She still is. So now you know, behind every crown, every temple wall, every carefully preserved myth, there were women who shaped the course of history. They weren't always remembered. Sometimes they were erased, but they were there. Some, like Hatshepsut, ruled as king. Others, like Tiye, guided diplomacy across empires. Nefertiti blurred the line between queen and goddess, and many more, whose names never made it into textbooks, still left their mark in ink, in stone, in silence. This story was never just about royalty. It was about power, about resilience, about what survives when everything else is taken away. Because what remains after the tombs are sealed, the palaces fall, the gods forgotten, is memory. And now you carry it. So the next time you see an image of a queen carved into a column or tucked into a museum display case, remember this. She wasn't decoration, she was strategy. She was survival. She was a sovereign in her own right, and in your remembering she lives again.